Okay, so this is intro to HR, to the beginning of the human resources topic unit. So, human resources is a management function of developing people within an organization to meet your business objectives. When we talk about human resources, this word right here, people, is basically how you sum it up. Human resources is one of the managements of function of a business, such as finances, operations, marketing, one of those things. But it is solely about all the people and all the persons in your business. So, what are the aspects of HR? We have recruitment is what something HR is involved with because they recruit and employees. There's dismissals, and that just means like basically firing or redundancies, which is also firing. Then we have training of your staff, okay? Then we have conflict resolution. This is a key factor to note down for HR. And we have workforce planning, okay, which is kind of just the overall planning of what your employees do and how it's going to help your business. And then we have your appraisals. So this can be like employees, like basically appraisal, so how good they're doing in the business, their evaluation. And then pay and remuneration is also an aspect of HR. Okay, so this continues on from HR, and now we're gonna focus on the idea we covered before, workforce planning. Okay, or in some times in business management they call it HR planning or human resource planning. So, workforce planning is just like planning and processing the anticipating and meeting of an organization's culture and future objectives. That basically means the overall management of your workforce in order to meet your company's objectives. Okay? So, when we talk about workforce planning, we have factors that influence a company's workforce planning, or yeah, I do WP here. Okay, so when we think about that, we look at internal factors and external factors. Okay, so let's start with internal factors. When we look at internal factors that influence like a company's workforce planning, the size of the organization is a key one, because the larger the firm, the more human resources need to be intact and on point, because they need to recruit more workers, or they need to train more, or they have a whole lot of more people to cover. Okay. Secondly, the strategic direction of an organization is also key, because let's say a firm's direction is to grow, or priority is to grow. Then the organization will plan to recruit more. They can promote more. Okay, and which is why it's very important. Secondly, knowing your organizational structure of your organization is key to influencing your workforce planning. This is because the organizational structure chart, which we will cover later on, okay, it basically shows you gaps in which the workforce planning might need to fill, or any places that are redundant. Okay, and it's a big thing to influence your workforce planning, as it helps you visualize what is going right, what's going wrong, what to improve. And finally, the finances of an organization. I feel like this just comes in with everything. Effective workforce planning cannot come without sufficient funding, because you need revenue to run every single aspect of your business. So why would it not apply to HR as well? So let's move on to external factors. Now, this is a little different. Okay, it's a little new, so I won't take time to explain it. Don't worry. But first, the external factors, we can look at demographic change. Okay, this just means the change in population and population trends. Okay, so it's like the variations in structures of your demographic. Okay, this is vital for you, because stuff like men, women, stuff, or like different cultures have different workforce planning they attend to. Secondly, we have this thing called a change in labor mobility. This just means the extent to which workers have the ability and the willingness to move between geographical locations for employment. So, when we talk about change in labor mobility, we have two types of this. It can go into occupational mobility, and then it can go into geographical mobility. So let's talk about occupational mobility first. Occupational mobility is the change in jobs or the change in consumers you get as you're working, and it's how like your employees need to be able to accept that they're willing to change maybe fields that they're working in or change the consumers they're targeting. Secondly, we have geographic labor mobility. This refers to the literal sense change in locations, change in like moving countries. So lots of jobs. So pilots need to have, obviously they need to have large amounts, like extensive amounts of appreciation of change and mobility because they're flying from country to country. But if you work in a bank and let's say you get transferred every 4 years, as a workforce planner, you need to understand if your managers and CEOs in the bank will be okay with that. So next we move on to flexi time. Flexi time is a form of practice within your business that is like flexible work. A flexible work practice in your business that creates like employees to set their number of core working hours. So when we talk about flexi time, employees always have a set number of core working hours. But as an employee, you can decide when to work these hours yourself. So the idea of flexi time is a big factor to influence HR planning or workforce planning, because if you're offering flexi time, then your employees might be more motivated to actually meeting your future objectives. And also, now we have the idea of a gig economy, okay? This is when labor markets where workers are given short-term contracts such as like freelance work, okay? And it's like on-call independent contractors who like enter agreements, okay, with like a bunch of external or on-demand businesses. So your gig economy is basically the outsourced work or the one-time work we do as a business, and how that is important to your workforce planning. And also we have immigration, okay? Immigration is key because migrant workers, so let's say migrant workers are people who move from location to location in search of job opportunities, okay? And in our world, it's not that uncommon anymore for people to move to a different country to get a different job. So once you're hiring people, you have to look at their immigration and see if that actually works as a business. And that is workforce planning. Okay, so the last part of 2.1, we have this idea of resistance to change, okay? So once you get into HR, you'll understand that once managers make changes, your employees will not always like that change or be appreciative of that change. So that results in what we call a resistance of change. So what are the reasons for this resistance of change, and why is it so important? Well, the reason why it's so important is because if you have lots of resistance to change in your business, that just shows a clear cultural disconnect, like a corporate cultural disconnect between your managers and your employees. It just shows no signs of compatibility, which can create bad working environments and demotivate employees, okay? So why does resistance to change actually occur? First, self-interest. Change can sometimes inflict on people's self-interest, like employee self-interest, that makes them outright. So maybe pay cuts, okay? Their self-interest is obviously not going to appreciate the pay cuts and create lots of resistance to change. Secondly, low tolerance, okay? employees, honestly, sometimes, especially low skilled workers, they kind of have a low tolerance to change because they just want to be doing the same low skilled task again and again and again. So this idea of change and continuous change can annoy certain employees, okay? And it's not just certain, it is kind of like a large number of employees. So a lot of you have low tolerance to change in businesses as they don't want to like have that sense of danger or risk in the change. Third, we have misinformation and miscommunication. Sometimes managers can miscommunicate, misinform employees, and give them wrong ideas about stuff that creates resistance to change, okay? If you have to fire 10 people, but then you say you have to fire 30 people, they'll be like, what's going on? So it's this idea of misinformation that's bad. And then fourth, we have an interpretation of circumstances, okay? This kind of links with misinformation because if employees interpret circumstances differently, then that can work against the business and create resistance to change. That's why information and communication is very key, and we will cover that later. So, as a business manager, what can you do to reduce your resistance to change? And we have these 6 methods, okay? First, the idea of education and communication. As I was saying, communication, education, educate them why you're making the change. Communicate them the actual change that's happening. Don't let any misinformation or interpretation occur that you don't want, okay? Secondly, participation and involvement. Get your employees involved into the change so they see how actively outright it is better. Third, negotiation and agreement. Maybe with trade union representation, you can, or just your employees themselves, you can go with negotiations. If you have to cut wages by 10%, maybe you have an agreement with all employees to cut it by 5%. Secondly, facilitation and support. Provide help. Provide support for your employees to go through this change. If you have to fire 10 people, give them heavy remuneration packages or heavy severance packages as they leave. Fifth, now this is when we get into like the later sessions, okay? The like more extreme methods, but manipulation and co-option or like cooperation. This is kind of like creating that sense of the fact that you're willing to like compromise, but you're not. So pick the, like for manipulation, you can pick the leading employees in charge of this resistance to change, give them benefits, but no one else. That is the idea of manipulation. And then explicit or implicit coercion. This is like, once again, extremely rare. That's like bullying your employees to like firing them if they don't accept the change. Now, if we go over to participation and involvement, and if we look at implicit, so here and here, we refer to these two as the stick and carrot method, okay? That kind of just means by carrot, you're offering a reward, you're offering kind of incentive. By stick, you're punishing them. So this is like, these two are referred as the stick and carrot method, obviously this being a stick and this being carrot. And that's all of Intro to HR.